You had some players speak this morning, so Paul and I will recap what some of those players had to say, the bulk of them on the defensive side of the ball, as well as recap some of our takeaways from the regular season finale and what to expect this upcoming offseason. Paul, have you digested the fact that the season is over yet? Have you decomposed?
It's always a sad week for me, Lance. You know, it doesn't matter how far the team does or does not go, or whether or not there's a postseason or even a Super Bowl. You know, when it's finally over and there's baggy day, in this case it was a Zoom baggy day.
A virtual baggy day.
Yes. Yeah, it's sad. I'm not going to lie to you. Look, the season from training camp all the way through the end of the season, that's the nitroglycerin that makes my motor go. You know, I love it. I absolutely love it. And it's 175 miles an hour, push the pedal to the metal. And I get very down when the season is over. Now, of course, there's going to be free agency and, you know, the draft and hopefully some kind of mini camp and so forth and so on. And, you know, but nothing beats the season. I mean, from the time training camp starts till the time the last snap has been played, that is the meat and potatoes. That's the blood of the NFL. And, yeah, so I'm kind of bummed. I'm not going to lie to you.
Well, I mean, I'm with you. I would take discussing games over any off-season chatter every day of the week and twice on Sunday. So no disagreement there. I mean, the good news is from a big-picture NFL perspective, we will have the playoffs to observe from afar. So that's at least a positive. The season is not officially over. We can still consume football. But, yeah, from the Giants' perspective, it's now moving towards off-season mode. And I don't necessarily get too overly excited about starting to preview the draft come January. I'd like to have some breathing room from that standpoint. But before we look too far ahead, over the last few days, the players and Joe Judge had an opportunity to reflect on what transpired over the course of this season. I thought today, from the players that spoke, Paul, my biggest takeaway from hearing from the Julian Loves of the world and the James Bradburys of the world, Xavier McKinney also spoke, the common theme was that group in the secondary, for the most part, because there's really not a lot of free agents and the bulk of them are still on rookie contracts, they're all coming back in 2021. And I think they were all asked across the board the fact that you had an opportunity to digest the scheme. You got more and more comfortable with it throughout the course of the season. A guy like McKinney got a number of games under his belt, that the position that will put them in when hopefully they will have a conventional training camp next season en route to the year, it seems as if everyone agreed that that's going to put them in a very good position entering 2021.
Yeah, I think so too, Lance. And, you know, the thing that we talked about so much during the past offseason was that you had so many new guys coming in. Obviously, a bunch of them were going to be rookies, and you had to do the virtual learning and all this other stuff that the pandemic pushed them into. Well, look, there's going to be an advancement of chemistry, of cohesion, and all of that stuff because they're in year two. But I will also caution that not knowing how much normalcy there will be during this offseason, it may not be necessarily quite as smooth as we would like it to be. I would love to tell you today, and I think the world would love to tell you today, for society's sake, that the vaccines are working, everybody's getting them real quick, and everything can go back to what it used to be in 2019. And that, you know, from a football perspective, all the off-season stuff can go back to the way it's supposed to be, and everything can be, you know, as smooth as silk. I would love for that to happen, especially with this young team. I caution you that I'm not so sure that that's going to happen. We were just talking to John, who's producing our show today, just before we get on the air. Yeah, I think optimistically, all these coaches and players would love to have a spring minicamp if they could. I think that may be the most optimistic aspect of what a normal off-season might turn out to be. I don't know that there's going to be a whole lot more than that.
You know, the other thing, a brief side note, I don't want to get completely off topic, but given what took place in 2020, and I'm not saying that this is going to happen, nor am I saying that this is a positive, Paul, but you wonder whether or not the NFL, the NFLPA, the owners and so forth, that everybody's going to reflect and say, how beneficial are OTAs? How beneficial are mini camps if they didn't go through them this year? got in training camp, do they maybe think about tweaking the structure of the offseason? I'm not saying that everything that happened this year should be adopted permanently. That's not what I'm saying. I wouldn't be surprised, though, Paul, if everybody takes a step back. Listen, the parallel that I could build is in any walk of life, companies, wherever you're working. Our listeners, I think, can relate to this. There's going to be companies that are going to say, hey, do we need everybody in the office simultaneously? Can we have some people work home remotely if they could be productive? My point is, I think if there's anything that maybe came out of this pandemic, sports leagues, corporations, they're all going to think about whether or not the way they structured things before the pandemic is the way that they have to go back to it moving forward. I think we all have to at least keep that in mind here.
Oh, boy, that's a good question, Lance. I think it will be mulled over and chewed time and time again. I did not see the final injury report for the season, but with about a month to go in the year, unfortunately, injuries were up. Serious injuries were up. And you're not going to convince me that the change in the offseason and the training camps did not have something to do with it. Again, let's wait till all the numbers are in. I did not see the official 2020 totals. But, you're going to have to digest those things before you start leaning the other way like you suggest.
Now, as far as what we started off with, I agree with you. I think performance on the field in the offseason is going to help that continuity factor that I was alluding to. So just saying, hey, everybody's coming back is great on paper, is great on the surface, but you want to then be able to build that chemistry on the field. Because I thought James Bradbury said something very interesting. He said, because of how convoluted, and I'm maybe paraphrasing him a little, but he did indicate, Paul, that this defense is not necessarily simple, for the lack of a better term, where, you really need to know what you're doing from a mental standpoint, whether you play cornerback, whether you play in the slot, whether you play safety. I mean, Bradbury pretty much came out and flatly said that. So I guess what he was saying was, if you have the basis of the scheme, unlike what they were working with last year, because they weren't on the field, they were all working through virtual means. If you at least now have that in play, now the question is, how much more on-field work can you get so that everybody is much more comfortable? And here's another layer that'll add on. Julian Love played a lot of corner against the Dallas Cowboys in the last game, and he was asked today, hey, do you think you went out and made a statement to this coaching staff that come next season, you could be the guy starting opposite Bradbury? And Love said, listen, he's open to just about anything. He looked at himself as a versatile player. He was happy that he got more opportunities this season than perhaps last year. But he also, I'm saying, in the back of his mind, I think, hey, this could be now a golden door that opened for me to maybe not just be a guy that goes back and forth between either position, but maybe tries to solidify himself as a corner next season.
Well, I think it's going to be a wide-open book in terms of how the Giants decide to use their versatile players. I mean, we know that McKinney is going to be a big part of what they want to do going forward. And the bottom line is that Peppers, Ryan, and McKinney are all going to be ahead of Logan on the depth chart. I mean, that's just about – well, I'm saying Logan Ryan. Love. Logan Ryan, Peppers, and McKinney will all be ahead of Love on the depth chart at safety. The best that Love can hope to do if he stays there is number 4. So if you were him and you were given the chance to either compete with Darnay Holmes in the slot or for the cornerback number 2 spot, why wouldn't you be eager to do it, knowing it's going to give you more snaps? I agree.
No doubt about it. I'm with you there. And that's why I think that I don't want to say it was an audition, because you're going to look at everything. You're not just going to look at one game. But the fact that he did get thrown into the cornerback position against the Dallas Cowboys and played well for the most part, maybe that now gives this coaching staff an idea of what they could do next season. Now, with that being said, on the continuity factor, Joe Judge, when he spoke to the media late last night, said that he wouldn't comment publicly on any teams that were requesting individuals to interview. So we want to make this clear. This is not anything the Giants are saying, but there have been reports that Patrick Graham is receiving interest, as well as Jason Garrett, which I don't think anybody should be surprised about, because Garrett's a previous head coach, and you figure he's going to dip his toe into the waters to see whether or not he can get back to the head coaching level. But continuity goes hand in hand, Paul, I would argue, with whether or not your coordinators return. Not in terms of Joe Judge's choice, but whether or not they get opportunities elsewhere. That's a big part of it. So we could sit here all you want and talk about, hey, the group of the secondary's coming back and this and that. Do the coordinators come back? Or are you still working with the same scheme? That's a question that has yet to be answered based on what transpires over the next few weeks.
Yeah, that's a very big deal, Lance. There's no doubt about that. I mean, do you really want Daniel Jones to have to go through a third system in 3 years? I would think
Absolutely not. Yeah.
The problem is, Jason Garrett, as we already know, according to the national reports that have been already posted out there, he's gotten phone calls. Joe Judge did say that he expects a bunch of his guys on the staff are going to get phone calls. He already anticipated that. He said, look, I'm not going to comment on any of these things until something becomes official, if a job is actually taken. But he said, look, I expect a bunch of my guys to get calls. And the national reports already say that Patrick Graham has been asked for by the Jets, and that Jason Garrett has been asked for by the Chargers. Now, I fully expected, and I've said this since the middle of the season, I think Jason Garrett is going to get calls to interview for a head coaching job, and it would not at all surprise me after the season if he is the first guy who goes, because I think he's going to get legitimate offers. He's a viable head coach in this league. And Brett Bielema, who already left in December, had always made it very clear that his personal preference was to be a D1 power conference head football coach. And he got that offer. And so he went to Illinois before the season even ended. So he kind of, accelerated the process. But, once he was I didn't expect him to come back because I know where his heart is. That's not a knock on him. He made it clear to Judge from the beginning where his heart was, and Judge understood it and said, hey, that's fine. You have my blessings. I'd still like you here this year if you're willing to come. And he did. So I knew that was going to happen. I believe Garrett's going to get a head coaching job. I think Patrick Graham, I love the fact that he's getting some consideration because he did a marvelous, marvelous job with his defense this year. But I would also tell you, if I'm the Giants, I would really hate to lose him. I mean, big time hate to lose him. We will see.
Well, I'm completely with you. And I would never be the individual, nor do I think Joe Judge has this perspective, and this is just my personal opinion, not anything that Judge has said publicly, that he would stand in the way of one of his assistants getting an opportunity. Because I think you got to look at it from the standpoint of, Paul, Judge was in the same boat, right? He was eager. He, of course, had dreams of becoming a head coach.
Sure.
He worked his way up, right? And then Belichick didn't stand in his way. Hey, Giants want to speak to him. Other teams want to speak to him. More power to you. I don't think Judge is going to do that to any of his assistants. But in the back of his mind, and what we were just talking about, if you were to ask me, Daniel Jones, if he has to now all of a sudden learn his fourth offense in as many years, yeah, I'd be a little bit concerned about that. Once again, my personal opinion. Not to say that it's not doable, but you know me, Paul. I always reference Alex Smith as an example. It's no coincidence that he didn't really truly blossom until stability came in San Francisco, where he worked with Greg Roman and John Harbaugh for consecutive seasons as opposed to the revolving door. And then with the way this defense has come along in terms of where they started, remember, Logan Ryan signs right before the season starts. McKinney goes down. You got a lot of movable parts, inexperience. And for where this group finished, both statistically and with the eye test, I think says a lot about what Graham was able to do. And, by the way, I don't think a guy like Brett Bielema should be overlooked, Paul, in terms of the impact he had in developing some of those linebackers this year. I think what he did in that room is a big reason why the Carter Coughlins, the Lorenzo Carters before he got hurt, the O'Shane Zimenezes, the Cam Browns, were able to show more than just flashes over the course of the season. But getting back to my point at hand, if you were to ask me, I think Joe Judge is saying to himself, hey, I would love guys to get opportunities. I'm not going to stand in their way. But ideally, I would love to be able to build upon what was left off in 2020.
Well, Lance, I will only say this. To me, it's going to be easier to replace the potential exit of Garrett than it would Graham. I think replacing Patrick Graham would really be a very, very, very hard thing to do. On the offensive side of the ball, the Giants have Kitchens, who, by the way, has been an offensive coordinator in the NFL before. He is already on the same page as Joe Judge. We know he's on the staff for now coming into his second season, and we know he already had a substitute for Jason Garrett in a game earlier this year or during this past season.
Yeah.
So I don't think that is a reach. I think logically you could easily see Freddie Kitchens slide into that spot if Jason gets hired somewhere else. I also wonder if maybe Jerry Schluplinsky might have some consideration and some logic behind thinking that he might be able to move into that spot, the quarterback's coach. And those two guys certainly would keep some sense of symmetry with quarterback Daniel Jones.
Paul, not to cut you off, I want to throw out one more name for you, and a guy that hasn't been named. What about Derek Dooley? Remember, he's a former play caller himself, senior offensive assistant. That's another guy that can provide continuity.
You know what, Lance? I wasn't even thinking along those lines, but you make a very good point. So I do think that that would be a bit easier to do. I have so much regard for the uniqueness and the amount of complexities that Patrick Graham instituted in this year's defense. I just think it's going to be harder to try to mimic or keep that wheel turning if he should leave.
I'm looking over the coaching staff. It's very interesting because as you have this conversation in greater detail, you start to think about angles that maybe I wasn't necessarily thinking about prior to the show. I don't believe that anyone else on the defensive coaching staff, unlike the offensive coaching staff, has been a coordinator or play caller. Just off the top of my head, I don't believe Jerome Henderson has had the defensive coordinator title throughout his career, and the same thing for Sean Spencer and Kevin Scherer. So, that's the biggest difference to your point, Paul.
You're correct, by the way.
With respect to, okay, so you've confirmed that with respect to the offensive staff, where you've got we know Kitchens and Dooley have called plays. Schuplinski's been a quarterback coach. He's been on the offensive side of the ball for many years on the NFL level. But the defense, not as much polish. Not to say there's not as much experience. There's not that previous 2 or 3 year period where you could point to, hey, this guy has had to call plays. This is what he's done. So I would agree with you there. Off the top of our heads right now, if you were to say easier transition to call somebody up to replace Garrett as opposed to Patrick Graham. I think that, based on the evidence right now on the coaching staff, is not a stretch at all.
No, and and Joe Judge, trust me, we know Joe Judge. He's going to be prepared for no matter what happens, because this guy, he's 3 steps ahead of everybody else. So he won't be caught off guard, and he won't be caught by surprise. If somebody should leave, he will immediately push a button, and he'll figure out exactly